Welcome to Congregation Lador Vador. We apologize for the delay in starting this morning's program. I am Rabbi Stephen Moskowitz, and it is my honor to serve this congregation. We believe here in learning and opening our hearts to a diversity of opinions, so I hope people will join us for our many programs. We are very proud of the programs we bring to the community at large, and this morning of our ongoing partnership with Theodore's Books, a wonderful bookstore here in Oyster Bay. We look forward to welcoming Senator Cory Gardner on Wednesday, November 16th at 7 p.m. All are welcome to attend that program as well. And this morning we are excited to welcome Michael Oren, the former Israeli ambassador to the United States. Representative Israel will offer a more detailed introduction of our guests, but let me first take this opportunity to introduce our congregation's friend, Steve Israel. Steve Israel served in the U.S. Congress between 2001 and 2017, including 4 years as chairman of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. He left Washington unindicted and undefeated to pursue new passions. And in 2021, he opened a small independent bookshop, Theodore's Books, here in historic Oyster Bay, his hometown, fulfilling what was a lifelong dream. He also directs the nonpartisan Institute of Politics and Global Affairs at the Jeb S. Brooks School of Public Policy at Cornell University, which serves as a platform for civic engagement and bipartisan dialogue. He has published 2 critically acclaimed satires of Washington, The Global War on Morris, and Big Guns. In Congress, he served on the House Armed Services Committee and the Appropriations Subcommittee on Defense. He founded the House Center Aisle Caucus and was recognized as a leader on national security issues and the Middle East. He lives with his wife, Kara, in Oyster Bay, Long Island, not far from our synagogue and as well the home of Theodore Roosevelt, who, Israel notes, also wrote a few good books. It's also my pleasure to welcome this morning New York State Assemblyman Chuck Levine and New York State Assemblyman Steve Stern to our congregation, and former New York State Senator Jack Martins. Please join me this morning in welcoming Michael Oren and Steve Israel to our congregation.
I know there's an ambassador here someplace. We have a diplomatic delay, Ambassador.
Oh, are we both going up there? I was just, it was such an introduction for you. I didn't want to interrupt
Oh, that was
you.
a long introduction, I know. And the rabbi wrote it exactly the way my mother
Hi, everybody.
wrote it.
Yeah.
Well, it's good to see you all. Good morning. Wonderful to see Assemblyman Stern and Assemblyman Levine with us this morning. Thank you for your leadership, support of the Jewish community, and everything that you do. I'm going to engage in some conversation with the ambassador. This is going to be a little different than most of the author events that we've had the honor of holding, because this is going to be politics and prose.
Well,
right? We're going to do a little policy, a little politics, but really focus on
I said to
this.
Steve, you never really get out of politics, do you?
don't.
You know, just don't.
You
It's
don't.
Like,
We all know the ambassador served as Israel's ambassador to the United States, a renowned author with 3 New York Times bestsellers, 6 Days of War, June 1967, and The Making of the Modern Middle East, Power, Faith, and Fantasy, America and the Middle East, from 1776 on, Ally, My Journey Across the American-Israeli Divide.
Are you in that book?
Well, you refer to Israel many times in that book, so I assumed I was. Deputy Minister, a member of the Knesset. Before we begin, this is how it's going to work. We'll talk for about 25 minutes or so, and then we have some Q&A. If you do have a question, Tracy and Dan are in the back. Just raise your hands. They'll bring you an index card. You can write it, and they'll bring it up front. And then we'll do about 15 minutes Q&A, an hour in its entirety. But I want to begin with a little anecdote. Believe it or not, the last time we were together, and you may not remember this, it was the funeral of Shimon Peres in Israel. And I was part of the U.S. delegation with President Obama to the funeral. And you and I, as everything in Israel, even the funeral was late. It was delayed. And you and I were making conversation. I'll always remember there was now King Charles was just kind of there. And Trudeau was handing out bottles of water because it was so hot. And Boris Johnson was there. And you were a member of the Knesset at the time. And I said, how's it going? And you said, you know, members of Congress have it much easier than members of the Knesset. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, you represent one district. You have a confined district of 800,000 people. If you represent the Knesset, you don't have a district, you represent a country. You said, I've gone to more bar mitzvahs than I ever thought was humanly possible. I got to cover every bar mitzvah throughout the whole country. So I guess my first question is, look, I don't miss Congress. Do you miss the Knesset? Do you miss the ministry?
Okay, so get there. First of all, thank you all for coming out today on this beautiful, bright October morning. Toda, Rabbi, for hosting us. A couple of acknowledgments besides Steve is my sister Karen, and Matt and Shayna, my something, and my mishpucha, and most of all Tammy, who's in charge of getting me through life. And do I miss Knesset? Yeah, I miss Knesset, to tell you the truth. I miss, and I bet you miss this too. You know, a lot of it is bureaucracy and fundraising. I remember your piece in the New York Times. That made a lasting impression on me. Your piece in the last time, how you go to Washington to do things and you end up spending 77% of your time fundraising. And for me, I don't know about you, but I was not a keen legislator. I was I didn't wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning and say, today I get to pass reforms on postal codes. That was not for me. I liked the diplomacy. I was involved in diplomacy. What I miss is serving the public, and I'm not being smarmy here. Okay, I miss in Knesset because we are one national constituency. I represented the people of Metula, like I represented the people of Eilat. There would always be a long line of people outside my office at the Knesset with things they needed done. Everything from sewers to legal issues, and I miss that interaction with the public and actually being able to help. You can actually help. And if someone would help me with a hair clip, it would really be helpful because this is not going to stay on my head. There we go. Your hair is thicker than mine. Thank you. Thank you. That's what I miss. I miss that. Mm-hmm. I do not miss the one thing we inherited from you guys.
What's that?
The filibuster.
Oh.
And we didn't have a filibuster. Someone got the bright idea that we should introduce the filibuster system to the Knesset, which means that if you had a very narrow majority like we had, you could never go home. And the Knesset debates would go on until 5, 6 o'clock in the morning. If there'd be a snap vote, someone would come and get you out of the bathroom. A little old lady would come and get you out of the bathroom. That was humiliating. You had to vote. So if you want to impress your friends at cocktail parties, ask them, do you know how to say filibuster in Hebrew? Anybody know? Filibuster. We had a filibuster in the morning. By the way, just before I go, is Carolyn Hessel still here?
I think I saw her walking out.
Well, Carolyn Hessel is the longtime president of the Jewish Book Council, to whom I owe my life and also my death. Because in those days, the Jewish Book Council would say, if you were a young author, they would send you around to X number of cities in 7 days, but there was never an order to it. You could have breakfast in New York and then lunch in Los Angeles and then dinner in Miami. And this would go on for about 2 weeks until you died. So I owe Carolyn my life and my... all right, sorry.
Let's, with your consent, let's spend 10 minutes or so on politics, and then we'll get into this exceptional book. Spend most of our time on the book. I have, with the forgiveness of my wife, Carol Longworth, who's here, I have been traveling the country doing forecasts on the congressional midterm elections.
Yeah.
But Israel has an election coming up on November 1st. Give us a sense of what's happening and how you think it plays out.
Well, if I had to summarize Israeli politics from the last 25 years, and I'm not exaggerating, they can be summed up in 2 words. And the 2 words are Benjamin Netanyahu. Mm-hmm. These elections are one way or another about Bibi. And you can say, yes, we have left, we have right, but more than left and right, we have anti and pro-Bibi. Why that is will probably take me 2 hours to explain, but listen, I worked with him for years. He's an extraordinary individual. He is an officer in Israel's Delta Force. He's a graduate of MIT. He's a business genius. He is former ambassador to the UN, former second ambassador to the United States. He's held every position you can have. He's been, how many times prime minister? We've lost count. He's extremely robust, but he has other characteristics that make him exceedingly unpalatable to a large segment of the Israeli population. And I don't want to say it's Trump-like. It's not quite like that. You can still talk to people about Bibi without them leaving the table or never talking to you again. We're not at that level of polarization, but it's very much about Bibi. And what the current Prime Minister, Yair Lapid, is hoping is to get another draw. We have now exceeded the Italians in the record for the most amount of elections in a few years. We're now going into our 5th round. And it always comes out the same because it's polarized around Bibi. It's stalemated. So what the current Prime Minister is hoping that this will happen again, and that the Likud party will finally say, okay, enough is enough. We don't want to sit in opposition again. We've got to get rid of this guy and they'll oust Bibi. I have heard now for more than a decade that this will be Bibi's last election. And I will always say it is always premature to eulogize him politically, always. I don't want to use a bad image, but you remember Fateful Attraction? Mm-hmm. The hand that comes out? Just when you think, right? And that's going to be Bibi. Mm-hmm. What is interesting about this election than any other previous election, for the first time ever in Israeli history, polls have showed that Israelis care less about security. Security is always number one. They care less about security than they do about the economy. Mm-hmm. First time. It's like we're almost becoming a normal state. People care about the economy. And the reason is inflation, as here, is off the charts. I live in Tel Aviv, the most expensive city on earth. We say that without pride. Housing prices in the last 2 years have gone up close to 40%. So that young people cannot dream of getting a house. Cannot dream of getting a house. My daughter is moving into a house next week that she bought 4 years ago. She could not have afforded it today. No way. And that's going to be, it's interesting, to this date, I don't know if any of these politicians, these parties have put out a cogent economic policy. I haven't seen it. How are they going to stop this? It's still about Bibi, not about Bibi. They didn't get the memo. Mm-hmm. Is the economy stupid? Mm-hmm. So we'll see what happens. Right now, Bibi's leading in the polls.
Let's talk about the Iran deal. 2 or 3 policy issues I want to discuss. Several days ago, Secretary of State Blinken said publicly, and I quote, "There's no imminent agreement, and there's no imminent agreement because the Iranians continue to inject extraneous issues into the discussions about the JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Agreement, of Action," which I voted against in Congress. Yeah. And as long as they continue to do that, there is no possibility, no prospect for an agreement. We continue to believe that a diplomatic resolution to the challenge posed by Iran's nuclear program remains the best way forward, and we continue to be determined that Iran never acquire a nuclear weapon or the capacity to build one, including the fissile material necessary to fuel one, but he didn't rule out a deal. What's your sense of that?
I could spend, again, a couple hours on this. Why the JCPOA? I've been involved in the Iran nuclear deal since 2007.
You and I are probably one of a handful of people who actually read it.
Actually read the deal. Yeah. I actually read now the claims of what the next deal is and why it's a disaster for Israel and disaster for the Middle East, ultimately a disaster for the United States of America. I understand why it was signed in 2015. It's very important if you're representing one country and the other to see the other country's perspective. I could see their perspective. There were people I participated in 5 years of the highest level negotiations on the Iranian deal, and I think that our American interlocutors honestly believed that it would help transform Iran into what they called a responsible regional power. That was the quote. And we didn't believe it, and I think, unfortunately, our position was borne out. The other reason was that America didn't really, America believed that the Iran deal would block Iran's path to the bomb. And we said it's not going to block Iran's path to the bomb. It's going to pave Iran's path to the bomb. It's going to put down sunset clauses. It's going to freeze part of the program for several years. Other parts it didn't freeze at all, like the ballistic missile part, the warhead part. And after that, is lifted, Iran could move ahead to a bomb legally. And the third part was that you could kick the can down the road, because America really didn't have a military option. Even though President Obama said all options were on the table, we all understood that there was no military option. Scoot ahead 10, 12 years, of the three reasons, only one still holds. Everyone knows Iran's not going to be a responsible regional power. Everybody in this administration knows that. They say it. They also don't say that blocks Iran's path to the bomb anymore. And Tony Blinken, much to his credit, says it blocks Iran's path to the bomb in the short run. Great. What's the only reason left? Kick the can down the road. The only problem with that is at the end of the road is the state of Israel. That's where the can ends up. So we left in a situation, if the agreement was renewed, that Iran would get hundreds of billions of dollars, not tens, hundreds of billions of dollars in sanctions relief, in business deals. We know this regime is not going to invest that money in schools and infrastructure. And we are already surrounded by close to 200,000 rockets in the hands of Iranian proxies and Iran itself. What are we going to do? The sunset clauses begin lifting in 2023. And in materially lifting in 2025, they'll all be gone by 2030, not the distant future. We are at the end of that road. So that's why. I believe, listen, if I had to choose the A team, and we can talk like this because we're not in politics anymore, if I had to choose the A team of Democrats to be running the foreign policy, I would choose this team. So I worked very closely with Tony Blinken when he was Biden's chief of foreign policy. Jake Sullivan I know very well. He's married to one of my star students from Yale, and I was with him just before he came into office, came to Israel. These people are deeply committed to Israel, deeply committed to our security, to the bilateral relationship. They are Democrats, and they are beholden to a party. And this is maybe your field more than mine, but there was a progressive wing of the party which is much stronger today than it was back in our day. It is not afraid of Biden the way it was afraid of Obama, and they exert tremendous influence. And so they have to pay the piper a certain bit. My gut feeling says, and it's only that Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, and the President of the United States are not going to shed a huge tear if this thing doesn't come about. You get that sense?
Yeah. Oh, you can't hear?
It's not working?
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
Have you all had a hard time hearing? Oh my goodness. You want us to start from the beginning? Okay.
We were talking
try and speak
about
louder.
my childhood.
Yeah. We're up to the age
and the
of
Iranian
7.
nuclear deal.
Yeah.
Believe me, same kind of like combustible issue.
You were saying, the ambassador was saying that Blinken, the president...
If I had to choose a team, be them Democrats, and we have policy difference with the Democrats, we do, on the Palestinian issue, which is kind of moribund, but mostly on the Iran nuclear issue. If I had to choose the three people to be handling the Iran nuclear decision on a Democratic administration, I would choose Jake Sullivan, Tony Blinken, and Joe Biden. Okay? Why are you throwing your hands up? I'm telling you the truth, because I'm telling you. I know these people. Do we agree with them? No. And I said also to Steve, I said, I have an inkling, I have a gut feeling that three individuals are not losing sleep over the fact that they did not renew the JCPOA. Yeah. And I think if I really want to go out on a limb, I almost think that they called the Iranian bluff. Did anybody following this closely? Why have they not succeeded in renewing the deal? Not because not because Rob O'Malley, who I think really wants to renew the deal, he's their representative, they wouldn't do it. It's because they allowed Iran, they gave Iran so much rope, thinking that they could get away with so much, that when the Iranians came by with a demand that the Americans couldn't make, it fouled up the whole thing. What was the demand? There are 3 nuclear sites, which we learned about. Our agents went into a nuclear archive in Tehran in 2018 and pulled out a lot of material that talked about 3 sites that had not been reported to the UN watchdog, to the IAEA, and saying that there's nuclear material on these sites, they have to be investigated. Iran said, over our dead bodies, we're not going to let them investigate them. Now, and then they say to the United States, we'll renew the deal, but only if you get the IAEA off our backs that they can't investigate those sites. The administration can't do that. Not because of Iran, but because of the IAEA. Once you buckle to that pressure, there's no more international architecture for nonproliferation. It all collapses. I get this gut feeling that they called them out. They set up a trap. Now, it's just, again, it's just the gut. But the fact of the matter is, there's no deal right now. And there's no way which the United States can get around this, the demand for lifting the inspections. The big question now, Steve, is, okay, what now? Mm-hmm. The president has said several times, and our buddy Tom Nides has said several times.
Tom Nides is the U.S. ambassador to Israel.
Who worked with Hillary Clinton when I was in Washington. He was the deputy. Have said several times a remark that has gone unremarked in the international media, and I think it is a potentially immense consequences. It's something that Obama administration officials never ever said, and it's this: the United States will never tie Israel's hands in responding to the Iranian nuclear threat. Get it? That's a remarkable statement. And my response to that is, okay, what are you going to do about it? Now, I'm not revealing any secrets now, but this was classified once upon a time. We made requests for capabilities. Now, this is going to come as a huge surprise to some of you. The Israeli army, twice as big, it's actually more than twice as big as the French and British armies combined, is not as big as the U.S. armed forces. And among the things we got these wonderful F-35 jets, right? We've got the F-16s. We do not have strategic bombers. We do not have B-52s, we do not have B-2s, we do not have B-1s, and repeatedly we have asked for them and not gotten them, whether on a lease basis or anything. I think it's about time that the United States provide Israel with the means of living up to that pledge that we won't tie your hands. They've done certain things. They're selling us thank you. They're selling us some air, refueling systems for the air. That's good. They're due in a couple of years. We also need understandings. We need understandings that are spelt out. Okay, if Israel has to act on its own, what are you going to do? It's going to involve a tremendous amount of ammo, because it's not going to just be about Iran. It's going to be about Lebanon. It's going to be about Gaza. It's going to be about Yemen. It's going to be about Iraq. How are you going to help us? How are you going to help other countries who may join with us through the Abraham Accords? So these are big, big issues. So far, some of the messaging I've been very happy with. I want to see messaging backed up with actual deeds.
Let's go to your book, because I have a feeling that when we do Q&A, there may be some more politics involved in this conversation.
Yeah.
My congressional bookshelves included every single one of your books. And in fact, 6 Days of War, I actually had a required reading list for every member of my staff and every intern. And 6 Days of War was on my required reading list as a member of the Armed Services Committee and the Defense Appropriations Committee. And so you were, for a good part of your literary career, known for your best-selling nonfiction, extraordinary detail and depth and insight. But the Jerusalem Post called you a master of the short story.
They also call me the master of the short political career.
Sand Devil, published in 2000, a trilogy of novellas set in the Negev. The Night Archer, you and I did an event on The Night Archer, an extraordinary, emotional, deep. I think I called it, if Ray Bradbury was Jewish, he would have written this book. Just an extraordinary...
Wait, he's not?
Believe it or not, yeah. To All Who Call in Truth, published in 2021, and now this book, which the ambassador will personalize for you at the end of this program, Swann's War. Before we get into the details of the book, I'm curious, as a writer myself, how do you make that transition from...
Well, you did it.
You did it. In a way, yeah. but I did it, but I never made the bestseller list of the New York Times. You did. How do you make that transition from nonfiction to fiction?
No. First of all, thank you for having my books on your shelf. I'm sure one of the books that I have on my shelf, required reading from my staff, you have on your shelf, which was Ulysses Grant's memoirs.
Yes.
because we're both
Absolutely.
Lincoln fans. The first time I walked into Steve's office, he had this great picture of Lincoln meeting McClellan in the
Yeah,
tent
you
at
remember that?
Antietam. I'm a Civil War buff. And I said, there. It was in Lincoln, when he first meets Grant, I want everyone on my staff to read this line. What does he say to Grant when he first meet him?
Well, I know what he said of Grant, but I'm not sure I know what he said.
Oh, you're not the one about the whiskey.
Finally, I
He
have
says-
them. Yep. Okay.
Yep, he says,
Go ahead.
all I ever wanted was someone to take responsibility.
That's right.
What a great line. Because that's what every leader wants. Wants somebody under him to take responsibility, because it always gets passed off. Anyway, wonderful. Anyway, back, how did I make the transition? I didn't make the transition. I was a writer. And if any transition I made was the other way around. I started writing when I was 12 years old. I was what they call today a strange kid. I had dyslexia. I still have dyslexia. I was rather a problem in school and not very popular on my Irish Catholic Sicilian neighborhood. And I was the only Jewish kid. And one day I came home and there was this pigeon lying there, what Monty Python would call an ex-pigeon, lying in the gutter. And I was very moved by this pigeon. I came home and I wrote a poem about the pigeon called "Who Cries for the Cold Soul of the Pigeon? Who Weeps for His Soul?" It was a comedy. And I went on to write a book by that name, Who Cries for the Soul of the Pigeon, when I was 13. When I was 14, I published my first poem in 17 magazine, believe it or not. And then I went on to write a film script, which won the Young Filmmakers Award from PBS. So I figured, I'm a writer. This is it. This is who I discovered. And later went on to Hollywood and, believe it or not, worked for Orson Welles. But at the same time, I got rejected. Boy, did I get rejected. The poetry book was rejected. I went up to my room and cried for 2 days. And I was very masochistically, I used to collect all my rejections. Those of you who remember what a Manhattan phone book looked like, it was the thickness of it was a file like this of my rejections. And then finally, I got rejected from the Holy of Holies. I got rejected from the Iowa Writers Workshop. Yes. Can you imagine that? They're so regretting it today, right? And my best friends were telling me I had to stop writing. They couldn't stand to see me suffer this way. And I'd always say to them, if I were a musician and all I did was got to play bar mitzvahs and didn't make the Philharmonic, it wouldn't make me any less of a musician. It's who I am. It's who I am. And the irony was I took the GRE scores that I got for applying to Iowa and used them to get into graduate school in history. Yada, yada, yada. So I started to end up writing history, started getting into politics, started getting into public life. But I never stopped being a writer. And because that's who I was. And it didn't matter that I was getting rejected all the time. And for those of you who want to be writers, you don't know. You're going to get knocked down again and again and again. And you got to be able to get up. My best friend would say to me, writing is fiction, writing is a lie. And I said, no, writing is actually the highest truth. Writing is the truth about reality, it's about people, it's about the human condition. It's also the truth about me. It's the absolute truth about me. So the transition went the other way, Steve. Mm-hmm. It went from being a writer to being a sometimes politician and statesman, and then going back and writing again.
Swann's War, 1944. Let's set the stage. Okay, and then we'll delve into it. 1944, an island 20 miles off the coast of Massachusetts. Reads a little bit like Nantucket to me, or Block Island, right? So
it's described as a poor man's Nantucket.
A poor man's Nantucket. Right. Female police officer who only has the job because her husband, who was the chief of police, is shipped off to the Pacific to fight the war. She is not popular. She's considered, this is Mary Beth Swann, Swann's War. She's considered an outsider, incapable because she's a woman. And it opens with an inmate of an Italian prisoner of war camp on this island is found murdered. First of all, I did not know that there were Italian and then learned German and Japanese POW camps all over the United States. Yes. Tell us about this island. Tell us about the...
Can you open up the front page? The front page
yes, I have the map.
has a map of the island.
It's amazing. Yep.
You can see if you open it up, there's a map. And you see it's a very detailed map. And it was easy to make this because the island is imaginary. It doesn't exist. And I had this map in my head the entire time I was writing it. When I actually jotted down the map after the book was written. Thought maybe it would help people navigate. So I made up an island, and island is off the Massachusetts coast, about 20 miles. I made up a history for the island. And yeah, it's Nantucket-like, but it's referred to as the poor man's Nantucket. And the major industries are fishing and cranberry farming, which is it's real, very true. What is also real is the historicity. So you often, as a novelist, and I know you'll appreciate this, Steve, you use the skills you acquire as an historian. So to write a book about the 1940s, you had to find out what people wore, what people ate, what they didn't eat, because there was rationing, how they spoke. And almost every sentence, I wrote a sentence once where someone said game over. So I looked up in the dictionary, when was the first time game over was used? 1970. Out it goes. You have to make sure that everything people would say, what people they'd say then. People said Jiminy Crickets or Criminy, both of which were stand-ins for Jesus Christ, by the way. Jiminy Crickets. And that's where Disney got Jiminy Cricket from the expression Jiminy Crickets. And I'm no fool. And a tremendous amount of research into automobiles and research into a 1941 Harley-Davidson motorcycle, how you get these things to work. So that's the thing. Historically, during World War II, 51,000 Italian prisoners of war were interned in the United States. They were kept separate from the Germans. Germans were considered real enemies. The Italians were like guys who had made a bad decision. And even though some of them were actually fascists. And because after 1943, the first time Mussolini was ousted, part of the Italians went over to the Allied side. World War II was also a civil war for the Italians. And so the history of this is very interesting. And the Italians were kept under minimum security. They were allowed to work. They became an essential part of the workforce. They worked in the docks. They worked in fishing. They worked in farming. What the book also points out, which I didn't know, it became part of the research, was the oppression of Italian Americans during World War II. So the same presidential directive, which had labeled Roosevelt to intern tens and tens of thousands of Japanese Americans, was also used to intern thousands of Italian Americans, and to keep them under surveillance, to sequester all parts of their property. Among the victims of this were Joe DiMaggio's parents. Hard to imagine. You be Italian American, you get a knock on the door, and the FBI's there to cart you away, or cart away your radio, parts of your furniture. Amazing what went on. And yet 1 out of every 10 GIs was Italian American. 1 out of every 10 GIs. I know my father's best friend in World War II was Joe Mamone from Boston, Italian. And that was very, very common. So that the book explores this, and you encounter it. You encounter the prejudice against Italians, but you also encounter the reality of Italian prisoners of war interacting with the Mary Beth Swann. There are historical events in the book. The Coconut Grove fire in Boston, which my parents were supposed to attend, but they didn't that night, and so survived. The prejudice against Catholics, which we have a Catholic president today. No one ever thinks about that. Back, when Kennedy was running, well, that was a big thing. And if you are on an island where there are no Catholics, there are only Congregationalists, the presence of a papist in your midst becomes an issue. So that's it. That's the history of it, and it's deep in it. Last point is that this is about a policewoman. In the 1940s, policewomen were referred to as women policemen. They did not carry guns. They did not walk beats. There were certainly no police captains. And so for Mary Beth Swann, who finds herself by default being the police captain of this island and carrying a gun, it's a big deal.
Let me just take one moment to tell the folks who are viewing this by live stream, courtesy of the synagogue, that you can purchase Swann's War. If you're not here, you can't get your personally inscribed copy, but you can purchase it from, now this is what I have to do now. I used to self-promote as a congressman. Now I have to remind people, it's theodoresbooks.com. You can get it online. It will be shipped to you in the same way that other book company that you may have heard of ships books. but this is a good way of buying local and supporting your independent bookseller. Let's talk a little bit more about the book. It is a murder mystery. It is a police detective story. Writing history involves a lot of research, but you're writing linearly, right? Latitudinally. This is writing a book like this, it's a very, very complex to get the plot structure correct, right? It's a whodunit, and you've got to make sure you're moving your characters around properly, that you're propulsive, that you're holding the tension at all times. It's not difficult in my view, I hope I don't offend you, but not that difficult in my view as somebody who's written history, to write history because you're researching, you're following it along. But this, you're inventing a plot, you're inventing a place, you're inventing these characters. How are you able to develop this amazing structure that is so propulsive, that holds our interest from
one of the most
page
difficult
one
things,
to the end?
One of the most difficult things I've ever done. I can't stress how difficult writing a whodunit is.
Yeah.
If you've never done it before. Why? You've got to lead your reader down cul-de-sacs. You have to get to an end of the book, and when you resolve the murder, the reader can't say, "Ah, crap, he's just making that up." The reader has to say, "Oh my God, how could I not have seen that happen? How could that be right in front of me and not see that?" You know how difficult that is? Tremendously difficult. I'll reveal a dirty little secret about the book. 3/4 of the way of the book, I did not know who did it.
This is true?
I was on the manhunt along with Mary Beth Swann. I was hunting down they're following down the clues and not getting anywhere, and also going down cul-de-sacs. And I was experiencing her frustration. And only very belatedly did I find out who did it. Almost at the time she did. I was maybe a step or two ahead, not much more, which was terrifying and thrilling at the same time.
The book has been favorably reviewed, and many of the reviews have one thing in common. They talk about your vivid prose, your delineation. With your consent, I just want to read 2 paragraphs, if I may, that gives you kind of a sense of how vivid this story is. Now, again, Mary Beth Swann, the female police officer. Alone again, Mary Beth looked around the station. There wasn't much to observe. 2 radios, a Philco Cathedral she listened to those nights when nothing happened, which was virtually always, and a 2-way Motorola hooked up to the coupe in case of an emergency, which they never had. An electric fan, not yet necessary in this still cool May, perched on military-style file cabinets that she knew stood mostly empty. 2 blinded windows and walls with the island's usual bric-a-brac, a spindled ship wheel, an untamed whaler's portrait, a mounted 3-foot cusk, along with a map of Fourth Cliff. The island is called Fourth Cliff. The locals likened it to a fishhook, but to Mary Beth it was saxophone-shaped, thick and curved at the point of the town, wide at one end and tapered at the other, painted some years before. The map was missing both the emplacement and the prisoner of war camp, though both had been penciled in. One more paragraph. The station was a rickety affair, always in danger of blowing away in some gale. If so, the desk alone would remain, fashioned from sturdy black ash, sat on lion's paws and housed coffin-like drawers and a blotter of seafoam green. On this, Mary Beth laid her head, chin first, and considered her bleak situation. She tried, sweetly painful though, as it was, to remember just how it was that got her there. Isn't that phenomenal? Does that not paint a picture?
Thank you.
Doesn't that paint a great picture? So I'm going to ask you the inevitable question.
Right.
Tell us about Mary Beth. What inspired Mary Beth? What developed her as a character?
You know, I'm going to disappoint you. I don't know. Most of my stories, from Night Archer, are usually about 3 things. Okay, they're about the story, which is hopefully entertaining and you enjoy it. The second thing is about my experiences. So if it's a story about diplomacy, or a story about Hollywood, or about academia, or about war, things I have experienced firsthand, I can write about them. But the third aspect was the most important, which is I want to be able to say in everything I write something about the human condition, something about love, something about relationships, something about us And this book is no different. Where I find is that what experiences do I draw on, other than the fact that a very nice former senator from Minnesota enabled us to vacation a couple of times in Nantucket during my tenure in Washington. It's not a tremendous amount of experience I draw on, other than my father's World War II experiences and what life was like in the 40s in this country. The second part, hopefully it's an entertaining story, but I do want to say something about the human condition, and particularly the condition of this person, Mary Beth Swann. So she appeared to me, as all my characters appear to me, in rather two-dimensional form, and then they begin to fill out.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the joy of writing is getting to know your characters. And I got to know this young woman. She's short of 30. She's sturdily built. She has very stark green eyes. She's severely pretty, short black hair. She's like a white Irish or a black Irish. And she's tough. She gets no support from anybody, certainly not from her father, who was also a cop but doesn't believe that she's a serious police law enforcement person. And you get to learn a person who is full of insecurities, full of self-doubts, has nervous, has passions, but at the end of the day is deeply and indefatigably courageous. Courageous. I kind of worry because there's a great sensitivity in this country to having heroes who are kind of like flawless. And I'm not going to mention any names, but I read a lot of current American fiction, especially the bestsellers, and I find the characters largely unbelievable. Mm-hmm. And I was afraid that this character was going to be too believable because she is a real human being. The book, if I may, is dedicated to Paula Miller, who passed away some years ago. Just a word about Paula Miller. I tell this story a bit in the acknowledgments. Paula Miller was, I worked out in Hollywood. I said I worked for Orson Welles. Some of you may be old enough to remember the Paul Masson wine commercials. As Paul Masson said 100 years ago, no wine before its time. I held the cue cards for that. So, but then it was over, and I was out for a job. So I went to the Jewish Welfare Board, and they had these little things called, you may remember them, index cards, and they were looking for a window washer. So I went to work. I went to wash windows for Paula Miller, who was a screenwriter. Her husband was a famous director, and she said to me, "You can wash my windows on one condition." That you never ever interrupt me and my writing partner, because we're writing film script. I know you're a screenwriter. I know you're aspiring. We don't want to hear it. Wash my windows. So for days, I'm washing these windows in Beverly Hills, and they're stuck on the title. They're writing a vampire comedy, which no one had ever written before. And finally, they turn to me and she says to me, "Okay, big guy, we know you have a title. What's the title?" And I said, "Love at First Bite." So I became part of her writing group. And she proceeded to give me lessons in writing, something you can't learn in a university, believe me. And they had numbers. And number 264 was, I think, the most important writing lesson I've ever learned. And that is, you as a writer are a creator. You're godlike. And when you create a character, you have a responsibility to that character. You just can't leave, a waiter comes over, takes an order, and leaves. That waiter has to have a personality. That waiter has to have a presence. That waiter has to have a soul. Dickens was a master of this, by the way. Dickens was a master. And I hope to do this in this book. That's why I dedicated this book. I hope that every character in this book is actually a real human being. You can't always do it, but you come close to it.
It comes across.
It comes across.
Absolutely.
And I wanted to thank Paula, belatedly for that lesson.
You mentioned your dad, and I know your family is here. Your dad was part of the D-Day invasion in Normandy.
Yeah, he came. He wasn't on the first wave, but he came across in D-Day.
And Battle of the Bulge in Korea would take you to look at coastal defense batteries. How much of your dad influenced? I know he influenced some of your short stories. Right. How much of your dad's influence is in Swann's War?
A lot. It's all the men on this island are all gone. The able-bodied men are all gone. Most of the able-bodied women are gone. They've gone off to the coast to work in war factories. And how this war impacted the lives of individuals. And And there are references throughout. Now, I on purpose, Mary Beth's husband, Archie Swann, doesn't go to fight in Europe. He fights in the South Pacific. It's a very different war. My father said he liberated Paris 11 times. Right? They got weekends off. You know, most of the time they weren't fighting. If you were fighting in the South Pacific, you were in the jungle. You didn't get a weekend off. Right? There was no Paris to go to. You sat there in the muck. And one of the issues that my editors had trouble with was that the lateness with which letters arrived. They had trouble with some of my timelines, and I had to remind them that in World War II, if you wrote a letter, right, in Saipan, right, to an island off the Mass, it didn't reach you the next day. It took weeks and weeks. And you know, that was part of this reality. And the letters that Archie writes home talks about his experiences in the jungles. The Battle of Saipan, by the way, and Michael Ashner's here, he's a military historian. Saipan was many, many times bigger than the landing on Normandy.
Yes, because of the movie. The movie focuses you on the first wave
Right.
at Omaha Beach, so you have a sense that's everything on at D-Day, which was not.
Which was not.
Saipan was a underestimated invasion, which the Japanese had 20,000 troops all over the country. The United States had 7,000 troops that died. And it was a 6-week campaign for a small, tiny island, as big as Oyster Bay.
I mean, who ever heard of Saipan? You don't hear it. But Archie's in Saipan. Archie's in a couple of battles you never heard of. And that comes across in the war. So all this is influenced by, very much influenced by my father's experiences. My second novel, which, like many of my previous works of fiction, sold dozens of copies, was called Reunion. And that was directly taken from my father's stories in World War II. It's about a reunion of soldiers who fought in the Battle of the Bulge. And I drew heavily on the stories he told me.
You have a wonderful letter in here from Archie to Mary Beth. I'm just going to read the first paragraph because, again, everything in this book is so vivid and puts you into that moment. She had, it took weeks. It was postmarked March 23rd, 1944, but this is weeks later. She had been postmarked on an island so small she couldn't find it in any atlas. The location of its pushpin only guessed. For days she'd carried the mud-stained note folded in her jacket pocket, taking it out repeatedly to read, "Dearest Muffy Buns."
He always calls it
Dearest Muffy Buns.
Yeah.
It rains here, that's all it does. Hard rains, soft rains, drizzles and downpours, but rarely a speck of sky. And in the few times it shows, the sun is so strong it can shear your skin off. So we're wet all the time, whether from the showers or our own sweat, and our toes are starting to rot. Who'd ever think I'd miss the Japanese? Who'd ever think I'd long for nothing more than a single moment with you in our lighthouse, snuggled against the storm?
It's so funny. Now that I hear this, where did I get that?
So that was
why are they never dry? Well, my father carried with him always, and Karen, you remember this. He had this little collection of sad sack cartoons from the war. And one of the most indelible memories I have of this collection of sad sack cartoons was sad sack in the Pacific, and he's carrying a 50 caliber machine gun, a water cooled machine gun, in the rain, and he's dripping wet. And then the sun comes out, and he's dripping wet. And that was the cartoon. It was funny, but that actually made it into the first line of this letter, saying we're wet all the time. If we're not wet from rain, we're wet from sweat. We're just wet. But I hadn't realized that till you just read it.
What are you working on now?
Working on three things. Okay, so I have another book coming out in April, which is nonfiction. It is called Israel 2048. It is a project that I began with Netanyahu when I was in the Prime Minister's office. It's an attempt to look at Israel on its 100th birthday.
Wow.
But from every perspective. It's social policy, it's educational policy, foreign policy, U.S.-Israel diaspora relations, Israel-American relations, everything. Palestinians, of course, Arabs. Very, very ambitious process. We didn't finish it when I was in government. I later worked on it with Natan Sharansky in the Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. Then that fell to COVID as well. And for the period of COVID, I basically, hunkered down and wrote this thing, and it's being published this spring. It's also an NGO that encourages dialogue, particularly among young Israelis and young American Jews about Israel's future. And it's dear to my heart. I am completing my next collection of short stories. I've got one more to go. I don't have a working title yet. I wish people would read more short stories. It's a challenged genre today. I love it. A short story writer has to do in 3 pages what a novelist does in 300. It's the haiku of fiction. It's a wonderful discipline. And I have a contract from Random House to write the hopefully definitive history of Israel's War of Independence. The difference between,
War of Independence.
War of Independence, 1948. It's a challenge because back when I wrote 6 Days of War, back when I wrote Power, Faith, and Fantasy about America in the Middle East, there were institutes that supported the writing of history. Those institutes have gone the way of history. And in order to write a book like this, to support the research, and the research has to be done in archives and sometimes around the world, you have to raise the money. So I'm also on the fundraising end of this, going around with hat in hand, so that I can now sit down and kill myself for 4 years and write that book. But I feel that there really has not been a definitive work of Israel's independence and War of Independence. None. Think about it. And I can say this certainly in a synagogue. I mean, the regnant narrative out there is that this was a war of colonialism and oppression and apartheid and genocide. Yeah, but it wasn't. But there's no book that's going to tell young people that it wasn't, exactly what it was. And to me, it's one of the great stories of all time. Of all time. It just has to be told. So I hope to start that soon. Soon.
Will you come to Theodore's books when those are ready to go?
Can I tell you an embarrassing story about Theodore?
Not the bookstore. You mean the okay? Because
Well, I know why the bookstore is. When I was a kid, my parents used to take me to the Museum of Natural History.
Yeah, of course.
And there was a big statue out front.
Yes.
You remember, and it had him on a horse, and it had around the base of it, he said, explorer, soldier, statesman, author. And even though I was very dyslexic and failing out of second grade, I'd look at that and say, that's what I want to be when I grow up. I want to be that kind of guy. They took that statue down.
You're close.
You're
close.
working on it.
You've done it.
I could close my eyes and see myself at 7 years old looking at that statue. They took it down.
Have you?
Right?
It's ridiculous. Yeah, it's
They took
awful. They took it down.
He was
We're
being
actually
led
trying
by
to get it here.
by a Native American, right? That's why they took it down.
Yeah. Something
Right.
that I very strongly oppose. But
You
there's an
oppose it,
effort to bring that statue to Oyster Bay because this is where Theodore Roosevelt lived and died and worked, and our bookstore is our homage to Theodore Roosevelt.
It should say explorer, soldier, statesman, bookstore owner.
Buy books. Buy books. A big hand for Ambassador Michael Oren. Swann's War. Get it. Now we have 10 minutes, I believe. Rabbi, we have about 10 minutes to get to some questions that you have written. If you have a question,
please.
I see Michael Ashner has a question. So Tracy, if you can get a writing implement and a card over to Michael. And I don't know whether Assemblyman Levine and Assemblyman Stern have some questions. I know they've got other things going on today. It just happens to be an election year and lots going on. So first question. How should Israel navigate Ukraine?
Thank you.
Did you all hear that? How should Israel navigate Ukraine?
So I'm also,
they're
you hear me okay? Yeah. I'm also probably too active op-ed writer. I've written 2 articles, one for the Forward, one for Wall Street Journal, about Israel's policy toward Ukraine. And I'll summarize them as this. Starting in late February with the invasion of Russia, of Ukraine, Israel adopted a policy of neutrality. The reasons were threefold. One was fear of angering the Russians and the Russian army, which is in Syria, and our forces have to operate in the air, on the ground, against Iranian attempts to transform Syria into a forward base against us. And so far we've avoided clashes with the Russian army. We fear that if we came out on the side of Ukraine, they'd start shooting at our planes. A. B. Fear for the fate of between 400 and 600,000 Jews in Russia. Who knows what this guys would do to them. Third, had to do with the Israeli diaspora, okay, quote unquote. There are between 1 out of 7 and 1 out of 5 Israelis speaks Russian. And they aren't necessarily pro-Putin, but they like Russia. The Russian media is very, very active in this country. So we didn't know how this population was going to react to it either. I thought all this was wrong. I got on Israeli television, and I'm a frequent commentator on Israeli television, and said, you're all wrong. There were only 4,000 Russian soldiers in Syria, a couple of planes. Our army is more than twice as large as the British and French armies combined. Who should be afraid of who? And why would they shoot at us? The Russians don't want the Iranians in Syria. We're doing their dirty work. The Iranians in Syria for one purpose only, and that's to drag Syria into a war with us. The Russians don't want that. They're not going to shoot at us. As for the 400,000 Jews, I don't know. Nobody knows. And the Russian diaspora in Israel is very anti-Putin, as it turns out. A lot of them are Ukrainians. A lot of them are Ukrainians that speak Russian, but they're Ukrainian. And I think that diplomatically, strategically, if we expect the West to be on our side against Iran, we can't afford not to be on the West side on Ukraine. And I think more importantly, morally, we are the democratic Jewish state. And to me, it was incomprehensible that we would not stand foursquare along with a fellow democracy, and a fellow democracy, by the way, that was being led by a very proud Jew who once considered making Aliyah, Zelensky. I got lambasted for this. I can't tell you. They jumped on me. You don't take on the Israeli military that easily. And now you scoot ahead 8 months, and everybody has pretty much changed their mind. First of all, the Russians have pulled out most of their troops from Syria. They've pulled out their anti-aircraft units from Syria. And they haven't taken any great measures against, against Russian Jews. They've been pretty harsh on the Jewish agency, but that's about it. And we have now providing flak jackets and helmets. I would like to see us provide Iron Dome. Now, right now, both parties have said no. But Netanyahu just came out yesterday and intimated that maybe we should be providing Iron Dome. I don't get nervous easily, because I live in a rather flammable area of the world. I'm very nervous about Ukraine, Stephen, very nervous. Mm-hmm. I think that Biden's policy, which was a good policy, which was to deplete the Russians, was not to defeat the Russians, and they're getting defeated. And that can get very dicey, because this man, Putin, if he has nothing else to lose, is liable to push a button. And that's scary. And we have to proceed very cautiously. I would urge very high-level, intense diplomacy and thinking out of the box at this stage. Attempt to diffuse it.
You alluded to this earlier, and I think it's a concern shared by everybody in the sanctuary. Through ethnic studies, K through 12 Americans are being steeped in Jew hatred, anti-Zionism, and you are familiar with academia. Why has Israel been unable to communicate its indispensable role regarding U.S. security?
I never get this question.
Yeah.
And I always know exactly how to answer it. There are many reasons. It's difficult to generalize about campuses. There are 7,000 campuses in this country. Okay, well, you've got problems with a couple of hundred. But in those campuses, which are in many cases the leading campuses in this country, the anti-Israel bias is hardwired into the tenure system, which is almost impossible. This is a tenure system, and the roots of this go back to the 1960s. If you want to get ahead in academia, you have to have a certain political outlook. That outlook does not include love of the state of Israel, and that perpetuates, generation after generations, and they are the people teaching these students. And that's very difficult to combat. I know from having taught in several universities, the amount of attention that students can give to extracurricular activities is limited. What you're getting in the classroom is really what you're getting. So our ability to mitigate this is limited. I don't believe with Brett Stevens. My buddy Brett Stevens says that we should just forget about the campuses, do a triage. I don't think we can forget about them because we have students there that we can't abandon. But we have to be humble about it. I sit now I said we never get out of politics. I'm on an interministerial committee on precisely this issue. And I'm the naysayer there. I said, I often say that we have to be humble about what we can expect the state of Israel can do, because at the end of the day, we are the Jewish state. And we will be treated as the Jewish state in the West, not in India, not in China. And in the West, anti-Semitism is hard-baked into Western civilization, and has been even before Christianity. It goes back to ancient Greece. And it comes out in all sorts of ways, in blood libels and massacres of the innocents. It's played out in cinema. I'm very much involved in Hollywood issues still today. Getting a pro-Israel, even remotely pro-Israel program made is very difficult in Hollywood today. even though it's largely a Jewish industry. Very, very difficult. But there are deeper reasons. There are reasons also on our side that go back to Ben Gurion, who said, it's not important what the Goyim think, it's what the Jews do. And many Israelis have internalized that, particularly young Israelis. I go across the country talking about the need to do just this, to make a better effort to reach across the aisles to Democrats, to maintain bipartisan support. And young Israelis have reached a conclusion. They say, why bother? The world is anti-Semitic. No matter what we do, they're going to hate us anyway. If we have resources, let's not spend it on this. Let's build a school. And it's a very difficult argument to counter. I have to counter it by speaking Israeli. And what does that mean? I say, listen, think about it this, and I used to say this to my staff in Washington. Our job in making our case, particularly in a crisis, is to gain time and space for our forces to defend our country. And if we put these resources, if we can gain another 2 days of fighting, it's worth it. And that argument carries weight among Israelis. They understand that, to gain time and space to defend us. Not that we're going to change hearts and minds, but we'll gain time and space. It's the best we can do. I know that's not a great answer, but alas.
Let me ask, I want to follow up on something. You just triggered a thought. You mentioned your work with Hollywood. I'm fascinated by the popularity of Israeli content on streaming.
Yes.
Fauda,
Yeah.
Mossad 101, Shtisel, right?
Heroes
Love
Fly.
Shtisel.
Yeah.
Tehran.
Or the adaptations like Homeland.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
do those, what explains that sudden popularity? And do you see that shifting public opinion among viewers who tend to skew younger with streaming
Not
content?
much. Not much. And I'll tell you, I'm much involved in this. I'll tell you about my involvement in a second. First of all major studios have opened up offices in Tel Aviv. I'm represented by CAA, by an office which specializes in Israeli content. It's so hot. Excuse me, that's the term. It's hot. Everyone recognizes this. Why is this happening? I got great news for you. Jews are wonderful storytellers. Look at this book called the Bible. We are our story. We're actually the greatest story of all time. We're the greatest story. And our characters in our Bible are not, two-dimensional, Odysseus-like heroes. They're actually human beings with all sorts of flaws, and that's what sells. That's really what sells. And that's what these stories have. I mean, Shtisel, oh my God. Yeah. I watch it again and again, I keep crying, And so these are wonderful for content, and everyone's looking for Israeli content. We're really excellent storytellers, and there's going to be more coming up the pipe. It has not made a big impact on public opinion on this point, but people, some of them were adaptations like Homeland, but even like Fauda and Tehran, they reinforce an image of a country which is about conflict. Mm-hmm. So the projects I'm involved in Hollywood, and I'll tell you one of them sort of off the record, it's a Hollywood adaptation of the Hatzalah organization. If you know it, they're the people on the ambucycles. We have this, well, you don't have it in this country for also insurance reasons, but these are 7,000 volunteers on 1,500 ambucycles. So if you have a heart attack, God forbid, in Tel Aviv, they can get to you within 90 seconds, at least one of these vehicles, and they save thousands and thousands of lives. It wouldn't be great if like ER meets Sons of Anarchy, right? And that's what I sold to Hollywood and to Netflix, and we're working on this now. But I want a drama that shows Israelis saving lives and not necessarily taking them. And that was one of the big sort of big impetus behind this project, was to change a bit of the narrative about Israel in Hollywood. But there are several initiatives now to create production companies which are dedicated to making films about Israelis and Jews that sort of, they go around the ed of Hollywood.
All right, let's get to this final question. I know there are a ton more, but we promised that we would speak for an hour. We're hitting that 60-minute point, and you're going to sign some books. Do you see a threat to Israel, its survival from within, by extreme religious parties and groups?
So this goes back to when I sat down to write the book Israel 2048. I made a vow to myself that I would not be political, that I would not shy away from any issue, no matter how combustible and complex, and that I would recommend policy ways of addressing these issues. I concluded that there were 3 existential threats to the state of Israel. Some of them very much related, not including Iran. Leave Iran aside, that's a strategic threat. I'm talking about internal existential threats that would jeopardize our ability to survive another century starting in 2048. So one of them, believe it or not, was the Bedouin issue. The Bedouin issue. Now, I don't know how you travel to Israel, travel south of Beersheba, but the Negev, which is 62% of the country, is disappearing. It's disappearing under hundreds of thousands of legal structures in the Negev. There's almost no police presence, hundreds of thousands of weapons, drugs, human trafficking, a breakdown of Israeli sovereignty south of Beersheba through the Bedouin. And much of it is related to polygamy. Polygamy is outlawed in the state of Israel. You cannot have more than one wife. None of that. 30% of the Bedouin men have 4 wives. And it's not like Bedouin guy falls in love with third wife. These are women it's a transaction. These women are acquired and purchased in Jordan, in the West Bank, in Gaza. It's basically chattel slavery. Each has 15 kids. They sit on a mountaintop. Every Bedouin male that's having 15 kids, a wife, then gets subsidies for child care that we have in the state of Israel, so he's awfully wealthy, and everything disappears. And by the way, I know Bedouin who agree with this analysis. Yes, we're going to take you over. We're going to take you over this way. If we don't stop this, it's gone. I'm telling you, it is game over. It is game over. Just by Malthusian factors. Just will. The second issue is very much related. It has to do with the ultra-Orthodox communities in Israel, the Haredim, who are also effectively not under our sovereignty, though they're not living in the Negev, they're living in our cities. But the same issue you're having in New York, by the way, about secular education, modern education. Today, the vast, vast majority of ultra-Orthodox children in our schools receive an education that does not go beyond 2nd grade in terms of math, certainly no English. So we've been focusing on whether they're going to be serving in the army or not. It's not the issue. It's whether they'll be able to sustain the economy. 25 years from now, between 1/3 and 1/2 of all Israeli elementary school students will be ultra-Orthodox. The country will not be sustainable. If half the country cannot read English and cannot do anything beyond a 2nd grade math. Not. Very simple. This, by the way, not rocket science. Okay? And these are severe existential threats that are literally staring us in the face. And there's an increasing awareness of them, but not enough. And one of the big problems is that both Bedouin and Haredim, ultra-Orthodox people, they vote, and they vote en bloc. There were 2 major reports given to the government about the Bedouin threat. One by Natan Sharansky, another by Doron Almog, a great general who's now the head of the Jewish Agency. Both those reports were put right into a drawer. All right? The third threat is one that impacts every Israeli immediately, and that is the price of living. All right? And that has become intolerable. Tel Aviv, the most expensive city on earth. The housing prices that have gone up 20% in the last 2 years. We have probably the most expensive grocery basket in the world. Impossible. And this is in a country that's rich. By the way, our average GDP has passed Italy, passed Japan, and is now vying neck and neck with Germany. Vying neck and neck with Germany, just can't buy things. It's too expensive. We also have the largest income gap between rich and poor of any country in the world, except the United States, Mexico, and Chile. We're up on that list. So what's going to happen as the tax base shrinks, and right now it's about 90% of the taxes are paid by 20% of the population, but as 95% of the taxes are paid by 10% of the population, you can have a lot of people saying, hey, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do this. I'm working hard. My kids are working really hard. And something has to be done. And what's interesting is that, as I said before, that none of the parties right now vying have come out with a really solid economic policy. And I see what inflation is doing, impacting the midterms. Is there any issue that's bigger than inflation right now? Price hello? And I think it'll be part of our maturity. We say about Israel being a young country. I got news for you. 75 years old, we aren't that young anymore. I'm speaking from experience. And we are older than about 2/3 of the country in the UN at this point, at 75. And okay, I think it's time we grew up and say, okay, if we have inflation, then that has to be a serious political issue. Who's going to bring down these housing prices? Who's going to bring down the cost of gas from our supposedly energy-independent country? Having all said that, being the historian, I'll end with this. Being the historian, you cannot help but being optimistic about Israel's future. You just can't. We've overcome a lot more than this in the past. We really have. And I think we'll do it again. I think that's one of the great strengths of this country is recognizing finally the threats and overcoming them. And if I weren't optimistic, I couldn't be doing what I do in life and couldn't raise my family the way I raised my family. It just is. We are that type of success story.
Michael Oren.
Thank you.
Now, before, a little bit of housekeeping. Listen carefully. You're going to be able to receive a book, and it will be inscribed by the ambassador. Before you stand up, before you go outside where the ambassador will sign, a couple of quick announcements. Former Republican U.S. Senator Cory Gardner from Colorado and I will be right back here at Lador Vidor on November 16th, having a conversation on, can Democrats and Republicans ever agree on anything? I think that will be illuminating, particularly after the midterm election. When you were in the Oval Office from time to time, Ambassador, you were photographed by Pete Souza, who was the White House photographer for both President Obama and Ronald Reagan. He has a book coming out, and he's going to be at Theodore's Books signing his book in December. We'll get you that date. You mentioned Bret Stephens. Bret was actually here for a conversation and then had dinner at Michael Ashner's. I want to actually thank Michael Ashner. He is a partner at Theodore's Books, and when we have special guests, he convenes dinners with them. Thank you, Michael, for everything that you do. Now, what will happen is if you have a book, if you've purchased a book or wish to purchase a book, you can step outside and the extraordinary team from Theodore's, Tracy and John and Dan and my wife Kara will assist you with that. Another big hand for Michael Oren, and thank you to Lador Vidor.